president-elect, and I'm not by any means ragging on President Biden because I want to work for him. But if you read the statement, when I read it, I see something that I've seen before, not by President-elect Biden, but by other people. And if you read the words, it makes you feel good because he wants to marshal in an era of goodwill and turn around division and bring unity to the country. I've heard this before in my lifetime. My father heard this before. My grandfather probably did not. But these words make us feel good because we want to hope for the best. As I said, we like a good story. So in asking, what is the meaning of life? You have to ask yourself, what story do you want to live? Does the meaning of life to you mean acquiring all kind of wealth and riches and living in the best house in the best neighborhood of the United States, not wanting for anything? Or does it mean helping your fellow man? Or does it mean giving back to the community or meditating in a cave? You know, what is that meaning to you? Keeping in mind, we are social beings. Storytelling. We've been telling stories since the beginning of humankind. And keep in mind, we're not the only humans that had occurred on this planet. We are the ones that became dominant, partly because of our large brains, which allowed us more to compete against other humans and ourselves more than protect us against, let's say, the dangers of a bear or a tiger or a lion trying to attack us. You will not see a cave painting of a person failing in a hunt. You won't see a cave painting where he's walking back to his cave with his head down. We love a good story, like sad endings. We've been storytellers from the beginning. This is before feudal times when humans lived in small groups, tribes, 50 humans or less. That's what a tribe was. And in that, there wasn't one individual that was considered the leader or the boss. There was a group of people. More than likely it was the elders, because they had knowledge and they would pass that knowledge down from generation to generation, learning and building upon what the previous generation had. Everyone was connected, everyone was involved. We were nomadic before we learned how to cultivate plants. Some tribes stayed nomadic and others just kind of stayed sedimentary. And the tribes that stayed sedimentary ended up mixing with other tribes, and that village grew, or the tribe grew into a village, into a town, into a society, right? And then this fella came along. He is arguably the person who created racism, because prior to that, race was not an issue. We were humans. There were different shades of humans, but we were all humans. And Mr. Zurada, who worked for the King of Portugal, had a lot of expeditions. He was an author, but he had many expeditions around the world. And his trip to Africa, he wrote explicitly on how he felt the African race, the whole continent, was subhuman, telling a good story. And in doing that, it made it okay to enslave that continent, even in the face that there were many things going on in Africa that were on a more advanced level than, let's say, in Europe. But he painted a good story. And in the minds of the Europeans, it's okay to slave these people because they're subhuman. Justification. So if we talk about the tobacco industry, when they were faced with the information that cigarette smoking caused lung cancer, they had a decision to make. Do we give up our status in society, all the clout we have, all the money we're making off of this, and do the right thing and stop selling cigarettes? Or do we put a spin on the story, the truth that's been told, and create our own story? So what they did was they hired actors, they hired people from the medical field to debunk what the facts had told. A factual story, if I tell you a factual story about science, it's boring, it's not pretty. But if I tell you a story that has nice, colorful movement and characters that you can relate to, you're more apt to believe that. So that's exactly what the tobacco industry did. You know, Mrs. Jones lives down the street. She's 80 years old. She's been smoking since she was 16. There's nothing wrong with her. And Mr. Martin down there, he just started smoking and he's still an athlete. So it's okay for me to smoke. And then if I'm in the tobacco, if I have a job in this industry, I don't lose my job. So I will justify that too, to further my narrative on why the truth that was told to us is not true. We like present future, and we don't like future. If it's so far off in the future where we can't relate to it, it's out of our mind, and we can't. And this is the problem with this climate crisis right now. It's too far in the future that we cannot relate. So looking at this picture, these pictures, the man in the on the left side of the screen, I remember him, maybe not him, but someone looked like him. I was watching TV at home, and this commercial came on, and the guy said, "Come up to Marlboro Country." And he was like riding a horse, and there was mountains in the background. It was all pretty, and that really resonated with me. And I wanted to go to Marlboro Country. I told my babysitter, I said, "I want to go to Marlboro Country. Where is that?" And she says, "Well, you can't really get to there from here." And I remember looking in the encyclopedia and the dictionary, trying to find out where Marlboro Country was. And I know they had cigarettes there too, but I wanted to go where this guy was because he painted a pretty story for me. So I'm sure the early Americans, the European Americans, when they were making their way out west through Manifest Destiny, didn't think about the fact they were slaughtering or committing genocide to a group of people. And if they did, they wanted that out of their mind. So well-told stories became the truth. They're a bunch of savages. They're going to take our women and make them slaves. They're going to scalp the men, and they're not using this land anyway. They're not even here half the time. Why can't we come out here and settle it? They're not using it. And I remember as a kid also, I would watch these cowboy and Indian movies. That's what we called them back then. I always wanted to be the Indian, but they never won the battle. So it's kind of like, okay, I want to be on the winning side, but I don't really resonate with the cowboy part because they're like killing these people. And I'm more of a naturalist, and I wanted to be out what the Indians were doing. But you see the story of a wagon train coming across the prairie and the family, and then you identify with the family because the story's crafted that way. And invariably, at some point in the story, you know, there's this ridge, and you see a bunch of Indians on the ridge looking over, and you know, oh, there's trouble, right? So the family still makes their way across the plains, and the Indians attack. And the wagons try to run away, but they can't get away quick enough, so they make a circle, right? And the Indians come up. Instead of going straight in, they make a circle around the circle, and they're just going around, getting picked off. Maybe one gets through, but he gets killed before he scalps one of the settlers. And then just when the settlers are about to run out of ammunition and everything looks grim, what do you hear? The cavalry comes and saves the day, runs the Indians off, and the settlers are free to go west and settle and have a very decent life because the other people were savages. They didn't need to be here. And I'm sure Americans felt very threatened when freedom came to Black Americans, because keep in mind, we were promised 40 acres and a mule. We had skills. We could grow our own food. We could build things. We could text. We did everything because they made us do all this stuff. So their way of life was automatically being threatened at the end of the war. Prior to that, we were happy-go-lucky, and you know, no one was afraid of us. And then Birth of a Nation comes out, and a lot of other propaganda, this well-told story, built up fear. They're going to rape your women. They're going to come next and destroy everything we have. We can't allow that to happen. So they're treated subhuman. And if you look to this crowd of these faces in this picture, you might find one or two that are looking at this photo of this man being burned to death with disdain, but they're not speaking up because we're social beings and you don't want to be outside the group. They may really think that this is wrong, but they're not saying anything. The others are like, hey, great, let's party. This guy is not a guy, it doesn't really matter. And then there's a kid in there. There's your learned behavior. That's how racism is passed down from generation to generation, because you're telling that kid, this is normal. Don't worry about it. Same thing with those kids in the front row, seeing this man hung. Hey, my father thinks it's okay, so it must be okay. This is how racism starts and persists. And then, of course, the caricatures. How you see yourself in society is being reflected back at you. I remember seeing cartoons like this guy up in the upper right-hand corner. And, you know, and I was torn between laughing because the cartoon was funny and then realizing, wait a minute, that's a Black guy. Is that how society sees me? And is that how I'm supposed to see myself, as a buffoon? In Buffalo Bill's Wild West show, everyone who's not white is considered lower than white. And then there's always a white woman attached to belittling minorities. You know, you have the sanctity of the white race is through the white woman, even though they're repressed too. So well-told stories got us into the Vietnam War. Now, the difference between Vietnam and, let's say, today, which I'll get to, is Vietnam was the first war in the United States that was televised. We actually saw what was happening in real time, as opposed to in World War II, the Korean conflict, where you had newsreels, which were spun a certain way. This, we could see it. And the majority of Americans was not on board with fighting over there. A lot of Americans flew to Canada. The younger generation, as like the generation today, was not into doing this. They didn't see any logical reason why we're there. But the story was, we're over there to free those people from the confines of communism. When you look at this picture, what's the first thing you're drawn to? I'm drawn to the soldiers. I don't know about you guys. How many is drawn to the soldiers? How many is drawn to the lady in the foreground? Okay. When you see this lady in the foreground, do you see suffering, or do you just see a woman trying to get away? The reason I ask that, and maybe because I'm a man, but I think, because I went over this many, many, many times before I decided to ask this question. I think if that was a white woman, you might feel more remorse or pity for her than being an Asian woman. I could be wrong. But when I saw it, and maybe because, like I said, I'm a guy, I'll go to the soldiers, or where are they going, what are they doing? And then I said, oh, look, there's people in the foreground, and they're traumatized. There's a little infant in this woman's hands. But that's how I was raised, not to see minorities as on the equal level as, say, white people. That's how racism, it affects whites and blacks. It affects us all. There's the first Gulf War and the second Gulf War. Now, as I said, the war in Vietnam was the first one to be televised, but it was also the first time that American people did not support the troops. American soldiers were villainized during that war period. They were spat on, they were hated, people didn't like them. And we didn't want to go any more wars. There was no more big wars that we were going to be involved in unless we were going to be attacked. That's pretty much how Americans felt. But after that, between the 60s and the 80s, we kind of felt guilty about that and how we treated the soldiers. So when the Operation Desert Shield came around, Americans took the opportunity to thank the soldiers when they came back. We don't want you over there, but hey, we know you had a hard job. That's, you know, the whole tie yellow ribbon around the old oak tree thing came out. That's where that came from. It was us saying we're sorry to you. But it wasn't until the World Trade Center bombing came about that Americans gave carte blanche to the government to go ahead and engage in war again. So now we're going to go over to Iran and stop a tyrannical empire because he has weapons of mass destruction, which he never found. That was the story. And now we're in Afghanistan, a place where we wanted the Russians out of because we said, you guys are terrible going in this country, but then we go in right after them. And to date, that's our longest war in American history, with no end in sight. And that brings us to the climate debate, which there never was a debate. Much like the tobacco industry, the oil company knew from their own records and from other scientific records that their product was most likely emitting large amounts of carbon into the atmosphere, which would eventually, and I think they gave a date of 2020, cause human life as we know it to change and actually cause the extinction of the human race. That's pretty heavy for someone in the 50s or 60s. I can't remember when the first report came out. I think it was 60s to digest, but they looked at it and they said, okay, what are we going to do about this? They decided to keep going, selling oil. So they got, again, actors and movie stars that go on TV. They talked to union workers, anyone who would have been affected by the oil industry phasing out what they're doing into more, let's say, sustainable methods. And that's how the debate was created when there never was. There always was a consensus that carbon would increase the temperature of the planet and would change life as we know it and make the planet inhabitable for humans. This is the truth. The temperature has risen over time since the beginning of the Industrial Revolution. Human activity has caused that more so than natural activity. But even if that wasn't true, the fact is the planet is warming. And we are the only species on this planet that can change that if we choose to. So we can continue to listen to the good story or be uncomfortable and make some changes. If there's a chat box, I don't see it. Let me pull it up in case someone's asking me questions. I lost my chat box.
No question yet.
Okay, great. So here's the facts. The facts are the poorest people on this planet will be affected first by climate change. World warming. Loss of livelihood, loss of income, made refugees, health issues, and we're only responsible for 10% of the carbon or greenhouse gases that are emitted into the atmosphere. We do the less polluting, but we're affected the most because we live in the areas where these items are taking place. Factories are in poor countries. Poor sanitation is in poor countries. Dense populations, poor countries, poor neighborhoods. I'm not talking about, outside, I'm talking about here in the United States as well. But the richest 10% is responsible for 50% of the carbon emissions emitted in the atmosphere. 50%. That's a lot. But there's more. The top 1% is responsible for 175 times more. So there's a direct correlation with how much money you make and how much you're polluting. There's a figure out there that says, what income level is necessary for someone to live a comfortable life, and I think it's $90,000, $90,000 or $100,000, somewhere in that range. Past that, it's all fun money. So again, because we look at ourselves more in the individual sense than in the societal sense, we're always looking for ways to make us happy, external ways to make internal happiness come about. This is causing the pollution. So if you're rich, there's a study on this too, by the way. Poverty makes people not think logically or smartly. I don't know how to put it, but if you're, even rich people, if you're put in extreme poverty in a short period of time, you're likely to make bad choices. But if you're rich, the choices you've made, you don't really care about because you've got more money coming in. It's just, it doesn't matter to you. So you put yourself and the world in a situation where things don't matter because everything's disposable.
John, you see that there is a question now in the chat. I kind of think you answered slightly that.
Okay, my chat button, oh, sorry, it's on the side. Now I see it.
Why does the person at the top, 1%, produce 175 times more? Is that the effect of the business they own?
Okay, so we love toys. I'm gonna just say it like that. So the more items you acquire, the more pollution you create. For instance, like a person in the top 1% more than likely has 1, 2, 3 homes, many cars, running air conditioning. I'm making this simplistic example of this. Modes of transportation that use fossil fuels, cars, airplanes, boats, all this kind of thing, which tends to have them use more resources than the average person. Most of the pollution occurs because of heating and cooling and transportation. So the more money you have, the more of those things you use. So people who don't have money don't have access to all that. So if a poor person all of a sudden got rich, won the lottery, they probably do the same thing because it's a human nature thing more than an economic thing, if that makes sense. If all of a sudden you have $1 billion thrown at you, you're probably going to do things you couldn't do before because you think it's going to bring you happiness. I hope that answers the question. So you have your climate deniers. It's a 100-year flood, or it's an El Nino year. This stuff happens all the time. I've seen it before, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And that narrative, again, a well-told story, is fun because of their fear of change. And they won't let go. They won't let go of what they have. So this non-human primate is a great example. In places where you have non-human primates, a way to catch them is, let's say it's a termite mound in Africa, and a chimp loves to eat the termites because it's high in protein. You put a little hole in the termite mound, you walk away, and you sit back, and the chimp will come and stick his hand there. Or in this, I think it's a rhesus monkey. You open a coconut up, you throw some treat in there, monkey comes and sees it. Oh, I want it, sticks his hand in there, grabs it, feels it, can't get his hand out. He sees the human coming to catch him, he still can't get his hand. I want this, I want it so bad. I see the threat coming, but it's not here yet. We just won't let go. That's why we're in the situation. We won't let go of what we had or where we're living for the promise of something better, because that promise is in the unknown. I know what I have here. I know I can deal with it. I don't know about this future you're telling me about. So, person that sees this picture, let me ask you, all right, so when you see this picture, what comes to mind? I guarantee you it's not, oh man, that glacier is melting, and that's probably going to cause sea levels to rise and the Arctic Ocean to warm and eventually flooding in San Diego. How many said that? Oh, one person. Okay, great. But most people who see this will probably go, ooh, because it's kind of an exciting thing. You've never seen ice is falling in the ocean. Ooh, that's pretty, right? And even if you're up there on a boat, let's say you're taking a cruise to Alaska, and you see this, because people go up there to see something like this, a phenomenon like this, and they're probably going ooh and ah, and taking the picture and showing their friends, again, elevated status. And then maybe there's someone on the boat who says, hey, this is actually not a good thing. This glacier has been around for thousands of years. It's receding at a rate faster than normal, which is causing global warming, because now there's less ice that's going to reflect back into the atmosphere. It's going to warm the ground. It's going to warm the ocean, et cetera, et cetera. And that may sink in, and the person may say, oh, that's terrible. We should do something about that. Or someone should do something about that. That someone is you. You have to stay in the game. If you see injustice, you have to tackle it. You cannot be afraid of loss. This is so far away from where we live, and yet it's not. The Arctic is melting at a rate 2 to 3 times faster, or changing. The weather in the Arctic is changing 2 or 3 times faster than it is down here in the equatorial region. But what happens in the Arctic does not stay in the Arctic. It's going to hit us. It's already affecting us. When you see these mega storms and tornadoes that are much stronger than before, like most of them are category 5s now. I think this is the largest hurricane season in history, recorded history so far, and it's supposed to be over now, but it's still continuing. We had one, just the other day in Nicaragua that went through. It's because of what's occurring in the Arctic and the Antarctic. You just don't see it. How many know what a blue ocean event is? Great, everybody. So what this basically means is all of the ice in the Arctic on the water, once it melts, it's more than likely not going to reappear. It'll come a little bit back in the winter when it's really cold, but it won't make that ice sheet that's up there now in the permafrost, where it has this albedo effect where it's reflecting heat back into the atmosphere. It won't happen because it's gone. So what happens is the heat will come down and go into the ocean, sequester carbon, release carbon and methane. It will take over the permafrost, release methane gas into the air, and accelerate the global warming that's already taking place. You're probably saying, what does that have to do with environmental racism? Well, I'm getting to that. But let me make a little simpler picture. Let's say you got an iced tea glass, right? And in 1979, same glass that stays 8 ounces, you put that cube in there. It's going to keep it cool for an extended period of time. But now you put that same glass, same temperature, with the 2020 ice cube in it, it's probably not going to stay cool long. That's what we're looking at. And that is actually the rate of loss on ice in the Arctic. And it's not a good thing. So in biology, we talk about shifting baseline syndrome. And it's the gradual change of accepted norms and conditions of the natural environment due to the lack of experience, memory, and or knowledge of past conditions. This actually ties back to what I was talking about with the Time Magazine article. Information is lost from generation to generation because we don't have that cohesive tribe that we did in the past when knowledge was passed from one generation to the other. But on a biological level, what's happening is things are like I said, a magnitude of 90% less than what they used to be. We don't see it because that's not our world. Some examples of that here in the Key West. This family went fishing, look at those fish. It's as big as he is. That's his baseline. That's a good fishing day. And they're happy, right? 1966. Same family, different from, I don't know, but if it's that old man in the middle with the glasses, he probably did fish in 1956. And he's probably saying, as you probably heard your relatives say, man, the fish used to be bigger, or they're not biting as much, da, da, da. But his baseline has shifted because he's no longer in the past, he's in the present. That's a good day to him. Even though it's the same area where you saw those big groupers. 1980, it's still a good catch, but the fish are different, 90% less. And then to 2000s, this guy's still happy because he has no knowledge of what happened in 1956. This is where we're going to be if we don't act, because our baseline is now. Now, how many of you saw this picture and just had like a twinge of like, oh, maybe just a second, right? Because you have some kind of connection to this, even though you may or may not have been to the Statue of Liberty. This is something that's been in your psyche since you've been a kid, and you know it's not supposed to look like that. And then you say, okay, but your mind goes back to the way, but that's not real because I know it's not like that now, da, 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 da. And then we go back to being present. But that is what it's going to look like. And if it gets to this extent, it's going to be too late. We will not be able to fix it. And I think as Americans in particular, we have this mentality that we can fix anything. You know, we saved Europe from the war, we did this, we're always fixing stuff, even in our movies, right? Like if you look at Armageddon, all those movies, it's always the Americans that are fixing everything because we can do it, we're Americans, and we won't be able to fix this. It's a worldwide phenomenon. We're causing the extinction of pretty much every species on this planet. Now, have you heard of, we're in the 6th mass extinction? Have you guys heard that before? First time I heard it, I didn't know what it was because I'm not a paleontologist, I'm a biologist, right? But I looked it up. What do you mean mass extinction? The only extinction I ever heard of was the dinosaurs, like everyone else, because that's what you heard in school. In fact, when I was in school, we were told the dinosaurs died because of the Ice Age. Well, that's not true. But we're always learning. Science is always evolving, right? So there have been 5 major mass extinctions throughout the history of this planet. Only one we believe were caused by species on this planet. That was plants. There was so much abundant plant life that they ended up creating too much oxygen and snuffed out life. That's the prevailing theory right now. The difference between the plants and us, we're snuffing out life and we can do something about it and we're choosing not to. Plants, and hey, this is what we do. We make oxygen. What do you want me to do? You know? But that's not the case with humans. So we've increased the amount of CO2 in the atmosphere since the Industrial Revolution by one third. And if you look at the charts, which I might show you, it's a big spike up, right? And so that's a lot. We have not seen the amount of CO2 in the atmosphere. I say we have seen, but based on records, taking core samples out of the Arctic, at the levels that we have now for 14 million years. It is to the point that there's something called the carbon cycle, that all these cycles, the jet streams, the ice in the Arctic and the Antarctic, the way the water flows, it's all the system, which is very delicate, is all getting out of balance. And like you see here, is going to create sea level rises from 1 to 8 feet over the next 10 years. You're going to see increase of droughts, lower food production, which means refugees leaving their country, coming to other countries, and the countries are coming to not wanting them, putting up walls, standing out with guns, trying to keep people out. It's just going to create more problems than we're going to be able to handle. As I said, not since 14 million years ago, we've seen this much CO2 in the atmosphere. So we're looking at 10 billion people to be on this planet by 2050. We've already displaced 16 million. There are islands that have already gone underwater in the South Pacific that you don't hear about, that create a refugee crisis. Bangladesh is about to go underwater. Florida is going underwater. The whole, I would say southern part of the United States, but actually the whole southern part of the United States up to, let's say, Montana, where that line is going to be barren by 2050 as far as food production and livability for humans if we don't make changes. 300 million will be displaced by 2030, and the wealth gap will increase by 25%. This is what we're looking at, a scenario like this. And it's ironic that I show a picture of a cow here because cows produce methane gas at 13, they're responsible for 13 to 23% of the methane produced in the atmosphere, which is also a greenhouse gas. And we could reduce the amount of greenhouse gases just by going to a vegetarian diet. I'm not advocating anyone should do that, I'm just giving you the facts. If there were no cows, there would be no methane produced by cows. Increase of infectious diseases. I don't know about you guys, but how many have seen an increase of mosquitoes in San Diego, if you're all in San Diego, right? Have you seen a decrease in size? Someone should really do a study, because I've noticed that mosquitoes used to look like this in San Diego and you could hear them. Now they're gnat sizes and you can barely hear them in my area. You can barely hear them and they're the size of a gnat. I don't know if it's a mutated species or a new species moving in, but the evidence suggests that vector-borne diseases carried by things like mosquitoes will be on the rise. So we will see things like malaria and Zika and diseases like that were once eradicated come back because we're creating a breeding ground that's favorable to those species. So this pandemic, as an example, this SARS virus won't be the last that we're going to see. The Amazon rainforest isn't something you can grow back. Once it's cut down, it's gone. You cannot make another rainforest. And a lot of these diseases are kept in check in the rainforest. So how do we get to this point in time? I know it sounds like I haven't been talking about environmental racism, but I have. Because if you think about it, in the United States, the agricultural revolution, which allowed human population to grow mass amounts of foods for longer periods of time, needed intensive labor. Going back to that guy I told you about in Portugal, he created that, he made that possible by, I don't know if the word's objectifying, but making blacks less than human. So it's okay to enslave them. Prior to this, yes, there's been slavery throughout history. I always get this, people always say, yeah, well, what about this and da-da-da, and your people enslaved them anyway. And I hate that when people say, yeah, black people put blacks in slaves and chains and sent them over to the Atlantic. That's not really relevant to the conversation. But the agricultural revolution allowed the United States to become a superpower through free labor. If it wasn't for the free labor brought over here during the Atlantic slave trade, the United States would not be in the position they are today. And that was continued through the Industrial Revolution. Mechanisms allowed us to actually take humanity to another level by using tools, more sophisticated tools to create things, which is continuing today. The Industrial Revolution isn't like just 2 years or 1 year. It's a span of time, and we're in the computer age of the Industrial Revolution. So many blacks, after freedom, were promised, like I said, the 40 acres and a mule and a good life, but they never got that. In fact, what happened was, if you're familiar with the term sharecropper, after freedom and we didn't get the land we were promised, we ended up having to work for the same people that had enslaved us, because they had the land, they had the crops, they needed people taking it. Okay, so I'm gonna pay you, or I tell you what, I got a better deal. I will let you stay in that shack that I built for you, and I will give you the seed, you plant it, you give me half, you get to keep the other half, and we're good. It's okay, great. So they do that because they had skills. Harvest would come in, and all of a sudden, instead of getting 25 cents a bushel, he says, hey, this is only worth 15 cents a bushel, and by the way, you owe me rent for that shack you've been staying in, and you owe me for the seed, and all these things started to pile up, and you could never get ahead. You could never make any money to better yourself, so you still were stuck in a form of slavery. Many protested and tried to get out. And that's where lynching and things started to come in. This family, and it's a true story, saw 7 lynchings in one day, and they said they had enough, so they migrated up north. So the Great Migration up north was also a well-told story to Black Americans, like, it's better up there. I remember as a kid thinking that the South was racist and the North wasn't, because that's what I learned, that's what I was told. And I remember when forced busing happened in the 70s, I saw on TV, because it was in Boston, and they were like protesting against it. And I saw this white blonde girl screaming at the top of her lungs saying, "We are the rednecks, the mighty, mighty rednecks, necks." And I was shocked because, like, wait a minute, this is Boston. I didn't know they had racist people. I thought it was only like in Mississippi and Alabama. So our Black ancestors faced the same thing. There wasn't like this welcome, open arms up north for Black Americans. And even for Southern Blacks going up there, they weren't received well from by Northern Blacks because it was a whole different ballgame, a whole different mechanism, right? So now they're pushed in areas where they have to live in, like, say, 2 families in one household, poor water, poor sanitation. You can't grow your own food now, so the food quality is lower. Everyone in the family has to work. This is where environmental racism continues. And the ones who stayed down south tried to make it the best they could. The Spanish flu hit in 1917, 18, sometime around then. But in 1919, the 3rd wave of the Spanish flu was going on. That was our first pandemic. And this was also during the Great Migration of Black Americans up north. Stories started being created. Oh, they're bringing the flu with them. We can't allow that. So families were pushed out of towns. Riots started. The military was called in, the army at that time. But the difference between, let's say, Southern Blacks and Northern Blacks at that time is Northern Blacks, well, there was safety in numbers. There were more of us. You weren't like on a little sharecropped plantation on your own. You had people watching your back, and you weren't going to put up with it. And a lot of the Blacks were either in World War I or had just gotten out of it. And so they knew how to use firearms and whatnot, and they fought back. But this is where the knowledge I was talking about gets lost. The things that happened during the Red Summer in 1919 should have prevented what's happening today. The lessons that they learned should have moved forward as a nation, not just Black Americans, but as a nation. And what we're going through now should not be occurring. Flint, Michigan should not happen because it should have been settled back then. So when the establishment got tired of Black people, they went out and got new Black people. This was during the time in the early 1900s, the Boxer Rebellion in China. So a lot of poor Chinese were convinced to come over and get jobs in America. Same thing in Mexico with the Mexican Revolution. And they're given the jobs that either weren't enough white people to do or white people did not want to do. This is very hazardous work. Your life expectancy was reduced by working in the mines. Again, poor sanitation, water, food, all of that. Farm workers, same thing, long work hours. No one's in charge that's not white. These are Chinese and Mexicans, actually, and you may not speak the language. Again, like with the sharecroppers in the South, you had to pay for your lodging. There's a lot of things you had to do that didn't allow you to get ahead. And then once we were done with them, we tried to kick them out of the country. Chinese exclusionary. So the thing about this, I don't know if you guys are aware of, but Chinese were brought in exclusively to help build the railroads, right? And that was because of the gold rush. So as they're building it, they're coming along areas where gold was discovered. Chinese got together and said, hey, we want some of this too. So they tried to, mine on their own, make claims. The poor whites didn't like it. Murders, all this thing happened, but they convinced the federal government to make this proclamation to get the Chinese out of the country. And it was because fear of loss, fear of you getting something that I want and you taking over. They were just, in their mind, too many Chinese. Another example of environmental racism is Hurricane Katrina, which is the first big, I guess, super storm that is in our minds. 1,800 people died, mainly poor people of color. And the New Orleans effect was the rich areas were fixed first once relief came in. They fixed the French Quarter. They fixed the areas where tourism happens. And there are still some areas where poor blacks live that still not fixed, and they still don't have their houses because they don't have a voice politically. Puerto Rico is the same thing. Every year, a flood or tornado or an earthquake, something hits Puerto Rico every year. And the majority of the population in Puerto Rico lives under the poverty line. And yet nothing's being done about that. Oh, what little money does go in is usually siphoned off through political corruption. In Standing Rock in North Dakota, the pipeline was originally scheduled to go through Bismarck, which is mainly white, and they said no. And the pipeline said, we still want to go through, so let's go through the reservation. And the natives said no, and they still went through. So many people, myself and a friend of mine who's on this call, actually went there and stood in solidarity with them to protest it, but our voices were silenced. Even though there were great numbers, it still went through because of the political process. In Flint, Michigan, we're all aware of that. In 2014, the Michigan changed the water system from coming from Detroit to somewhere else, and it was all politically motivated. And the pipes put in were not up to code. In fact, they were made of lead, and they leached, and they caused this major environmental hazard, which I think is still going on today. I don't think it's all really been fixed, but half the population had to leave that could leave. The half that couldn't leave live under the poverty line. Their property values went down. They're stuck, and they have no water. And it wasn't until 2016 that this became known nationally, where something was done about it. And it's because, again, no political clout, because they're people of color. And here's the definition of environmental racism: disproportionately impacts of the environmental hazards on people of color. Because it happens to everyone, but disproportionately it happens to us. So because of all the protests we've seen in 2020, speared by young people, very much like it was in the 60s. And I think if we had the technology in the 60s that we do today, this would be a different world. If we had like smartphones and all that, a lot of stuff that we fought for back then would have taken place, I think. But begs the question, what about Generation Z? They're willing to stand up, they're willing to get in the fight and get in the game. The question is, can they affect lasting change? No. Now, I'm not being negative there. There's a caveat to this no. The no is not unless we have their backs. What, in my opinion, what needs to happen is this, and we had a perfect opportunity just this election season. People from that generation need to get involved in the political process. They need to go into the community and say, hey, John, not me, but just an easy name, we want you to be a city council person, right? You're gonna go represent us, and these are the things we want done. Got it. Now the older generation has to be involved with John and the other people to say, okay, this is what you're gonna, because we have the knowledge. Remember I said baseline syndrome? They have nothing they're pulling from other than they protest. They don't know how to navigate that system. They don't know anything about it, but we do. And so unless we're there with them, they will fail. So it has to be inclusive in order for it to succeed. And until there is a whole-scale change, a systems change on how we do things that's more equitable for the society, is probably, changes are probably not going to happen in a timely fashion. They will keep having these small little increments that we've had since 1919 up until today. So I have some questions for you, if you guys are willing to like participate in this. What do you think the role of government is? How many people do we have, Mika?
Yeah, we have about 8 folks right now. So it's your choice if you would like to just keep them in a group, you know?
I think like two groups would be good.
Yeah, you want to do breakouts? Okay.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. And I would like you to think about these 3 questions, but it's not the only questions. These are just starting points on how we affect change. What's happening in your community? What do you see? Yeah, based on your life on this planet, what have you seen that has changed for the better? What hasn't? and how do we get to a place of equity. So I'll be sticking my head into your groups.
Okay, so I'm gonna create just, yeah, I'll just create 3 just in
What's up, John?
Charlie was the gentleman I was speaking about who went to, actually he convinced me to go, to stand in the middle of winter. I was like, no, it was the greatest experience of my life, actually. It was just
2
really,
blizzards. We went through 2 blizzards.
Yeah.
It's crazy.
and in seeing that, you can see that there was a lot of solidarity and that there is enough power among the 90% that we can affect change if we actually stay together. That was my lesson that I got out of standing on it.